It's my pleasure, everyone, to introduce to you Denise Pines. She is a CEO, an author, a speaker, a filmmaker, and a health advocate. She is president of the Medical Board of California and serves on the Martin Luther King Community Hospital Foundation Board, as well as the admissions committee for the California University of Science and Medicine. She was appointed as a public member of the Medical Board of California by Governor Brown in 2012, and she has previously served as a board officer in the positions of vice president and secretary. At the biggest level, she is a longtime community health advocate and media pioneer. She is an award-winning marketeer, and serial entrepreneur who has participated in 10 startups, including multimedia companies and foundations. She has been a creative consultant with PBS and NPR for several talk shows, as well as 10 documentaries. She has 20 plus years of management, sales and marketing experience, and personally brand management and traditional media. She's responsible for strategic planning and business for her own event management firms, and she's produced over 150 events nationwide. Serious work on the health advocacy side, and we're just excited that she has graciously agreed to speak to us on the topic of wellness, and the title of her presentation is Wellness Requires Racial Justice. Thank you, Denise, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'd like to thank everyone for your commitment to the citizens of California for being the health healers in our community. We are living in traumatic times, fighting two deadly viruses, COVID-19 and racism 2020. One is less than a year old and attacks the body. The other is older than America and destroys the mind, body, and soul. Yes, we've had some wins in those who are responsible for the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd have been arrested. And countless other corporations have come out in public support of Black Lives Matter movement. But we are far from the finish line. While the pandemic affects us all in a myriad of ways, there's no denying that the crisis weighs more heavily on Black people and communities of color. At the end of the day, COVID-19 has become a racial justice issue. There is only one major reason why this rich country does not have the universal health care, good public schools, secure retirements, decent housing, adequate food, and that is racial injustice. To bring true wellness in our country, we need to promote health and eliminate health disparities. As I watched Congressman John Lewis laid to rest this weekend and on Monday, I thought about how he intentionally fought a physical war on racism as an apostle of nonviolence over and over again. Before intersectionality was a buzzword, John Lewis stood up for civil rights beyond the Black community and voting rights issues that were core to his work. He stood up for gay marriage, loudly denouncing the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act when few Democrats did, and directly tying the struggle for gay rights to the civil rights movement. In 2013, he was arrested for the 45th time in his career in a protest urging Congress to pass an immigration reform bill. Before he died, John Lewis stated, "This is a different time. As the polls have shown that Black Lives Matter is the biggest protest movement in American history in terms of sheer numbers, and beyond the tens of millions who have marched, Americans are changing their minds on race. A majority now say police are more prone to use excessive force on Black people. And 3/4 say racial discrimination is a big problem." Today's war is not so much physical as that of John Lewis's earlier years, but has the same effect. Harvard Professor Emeritus of Education and Psychiatry, Dr. Chester M. Pierce, termed it offensive mechanisms, now known as microaggressions. Small acts of insult or indignity against Black people, people of color, women, and the poor. This is so much more massive, and it permeates every part of my experience. It's when we go to work. It's when we drive to work. It's when we go to the store. It's when we walk down the street. It's when we bird watch. It's when we're sitting in our cars. It's when we go to the doctor or the hospital. It's every encounter we have once we step out the door. I am a community servant, and I must admit, I'm a wounded servant. I suffer from prejudice, anger, frustration, hurt, and deep trust of systems because of pre-existing condition called racism. I have lived in California, the most racially diverse and ethnically diverse place in the world. And some of my proudest moments was working with Tavis Smiley to use media as a tool for advocacy, which empowered Black people to stand up and speak up. And I recently produced my 11th award-winning documentary film, Push Out: The Criminalization of Black Girls in School. These roles have informed much of my thinking about the crisis we are currently experiencing and how we go about healing the wounds inflicted on those who serve our communities. Racism has long been a part of American story. Our Native brothers and sisters were the first to be targeted by white colonizers. Native communities were purposely traumatized through theft of land, broken treaties, blankets infected with smallpox, and murder. They suffered systemic efforts to extinguish their culture and diminish their souls through forced re-education, yet undefeated, they continue to fight for survival today. And then Africans were brought to the Americas, shackled in chains in the bottom of the ships, and sold to the highest bidder to be worked as machines for white enslavers. Over time, the physical shackles were removed and replaced by the structural shackles of Jim Crow and its variations. Segregation, poor housing, hard living conditions, little to no educational opportunities, poor health, food deserts, and imprisonment. Our racist history is painful to recall, and it continues to be written today. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and beyond these tragic deaths that have captured the headlines, there is daily pain and trauma taking place in all communities of color. Living in a toxic environment, you get angry, depressed, bound by a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. You lose your sense of self-worth and begin to harbor a sense of self-hate. This complex dis-ease from daily trauma can lead to self-destruction and the destruction of others within your own community. Our children raised in our racist culture suffer from both the threat of physical harm and internalized oppression. This is the moment to invest time and resources into community healing. A spark has ignited a new and renewed call for justice in cities throughout towns across America. We must take advantage of this new momentum to reform, rebuild, and heal America in the way she's promised to always be. I was inspired by one of my board members to make a statement to the 141 California licensed physicians while on the board call. And I thought, can I really do that? And then I did. I felt it was important for the board to stop playing it safe, to act like we don't have skin in the game. We aren't just regulators, but caring humans in service to other humans. My goal in writing the letter was to make known we too have a role to play in healing America. Physicians responded immediately. 50% of them thanked me how can they help improve race relations? And 50% felt I should not have used my leadership position to make an opinionated statement. I should also say that no one asked me to make any changes to the statement which I ran, and it went as far up as the governor's office. Had I not written that letter, I would not be speaking to you today. A few years after I joined the board, I was approached by several African American physicians who shared with me some data they had gathered indicating concerns about bias in the board's disciplinary process with regards to Black doctors. Knowing the multifaceted process we go through, I found the allegations to be disturbing and met with the executive director at the time, who agreed to conduct an analysis of the board's complaints, investigations, and disciplinary action over a 3-year period. Our data was inconclusive, but our ED suggested an independent, broader analysis using different methodology over a 10-year period would provide better results. So in 2017, the California Research Bureau conducted an observational report called The Demographics of Disciplinary Action by the Medical Board of California for the years 2003 to 2013. The outcome was alarming and supported the disparity claims of the doctors. It showed complaints regarding Latino physicians had a higher rate of investigations resulting in discipline, but it also showed disparities with Black doctors as well. It is important to note that due to the limitations in the study's design and methodology, that the California Research Bureau was not able to draw definitive conclusions regarding the drivers and the scope of the disparities highlighted in the report, which we know this information is vital as it could help determine the root causes of these disparities and the most effective means in solving them. Fortunately, though, this happened just as I became president. I took an delivered speed approach to change these outcomes. So first, we convened a task force of board members and interested parties to review the report and deliver specific recommendations on how to best proceed within 60 days. Second, we conducted a review of existing investigation, complaint, and disciplinary processes to better understand the institutional and procedural issues that may have contributed to the disparities outlined in the report. Then we engaged relevant law and policymakers around the issues outlined in the report to ensure that the board had adequate funding and/or legislative support for any changes recommended by the task force. From the recommendations, we mandated implicit bias training for everyone, for the board staff, the board members, the investigators, the attorneys at the Attorney General's office, and the judges that presided over our cases, and to make this training annual. Then we evaluated how cases were presented to the board members for review, and we took out things that could cause implicit bias, like what medical school you went to, or where did you do your residency, and your age. We also took this information out from the expert medical reviewers who provide standard of care opinion which guide our decision-making. Finally, we met with all the leaders of the African American Latino Doctor Association groups and to develop better practices when evaluating complaints. We also recognize that doctors of color serving inner city communities have patient loads that can be as high as 7,500 to 10,000 compared to the average 2,000 patients with doctors outside of these areas. To give some context, many of our complaints are brought to the board's attention through other parties external to the board, including patients, family members, licensees, other state agencies, the media, mandated reporters, and other state court disciplinary actions. These are the key steps we took to ensure the integrity of the process and that all physicians' rights are respected. I shared a lot of detail about our process once we received the demographic disciplinary action report, because it's a roadmap of how to handle complaints of racial injustice. Data is first needed, then an objective party to review, then inclusion of both insiders and outsiders to review findings and make recommendations, and they have to be represented from top to bottom. And more importantly, it must constantly be reevaluated to see if change has happened. Change is uncomfortable, but necessary to see progress. We now live in an era of speaking up. Institutions like Stanford must undertake a rigorous self-examination. Leaders must ask themselves whether their practices advance healing and justice, or whether they sustain racist status quo by supporting systems that have helped entrench discrimination and disinvestment. The emotional intensity of addressing how Black people feel in predominantly white spaces like medical school, hospitals, and even our neighborhoods must be evaluated. I am sure many of us on this platform who are Black have tiptoed around most of our lives trying not to make people uncomfortable at the expense of our own comfort. This is a quagmire for those of us who have had professional success earned in a white world, yet we must be able to create conversations that lead to human rights for everyone. We have been trying too long to be comfortable. I lovingly ask Stanford Department of Surgery to outreach to communities of color and understand how different cultures deal with all the challenges of healthcare, from chronic disease to trauma. How can you make sure that all your patients receive the most effective and appropriate care? How do you not assume that certain cultures won't understand or won't be compliant? So don't shortchange them in terms of not bringing your best help to them to get better. I am aware of the great way in which you have responded to COVID-19, and I applaud those efforts. But how have you ensured that communities that are just a few miles away can avail themselves to the marvelous testing and treatments you have made available to others much further away? Finally, how are you embracing and celebrating the diversity of the teams that you have at Stanford, which include racial differences and women's? How are you doing that? I think now is an opportunity to think differently. We are all having conversations we never have had before. And I believe my presence today that you're looking to think differently to shape health equity. I am determined to make a difference wherever I can, and however I can, by any means necessary. And I want to thank you all for having me here this morning, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks.
Thank you, Denise. That was thought-provoking. And I wrote down several questions. I want to invite those in the audience to unmute yourself and ask questions. I'm not sure if the raise your hand function is on, but Sherry's going to help me manage the chat box.
Okay.
So my question, wow, thanks for sharing that process that you went through with the board in terms of reviewing the allegations and getting data and then getting data again a different way. The implicit bias training, I have to say for us, we are fearful that it will be some short, unuseful, mandated video clip that has no relevant power, and it becomes something to do and get done as opposed to something with meaning. How do we prevent that? What did your process look like? And did it work?
And just to also, there's a question in the chat box that goes with this.
Okay.
What's the best practices for the implicit bias training? So sort of both of those.
Good questions. It is hard. There are a lot of people that say, I don't need another training. I know what I'm supposed to do. And yes and no. I mean, implicit bias are those biases that we don't even know that we have. those things that we have been taught since we have been children, or those things that we have experienced inside of our communities, inside the culture of which the community we have been raised in, and along that journey. And we come with some preconceived notions about things that we stopped asking questions about. And so, yes, we do. I have biases, right? We all have biases. To say that we don't is to be lying to ourselves. And when we lie to ourselves, you can't open the window to hear the other person and what they're actually saying in the encounter that they're actually having with you. So implicit bias training is very, very useful. It does have to be long, meaning initially it needs to be probably 4 hours of something that you go through. And then it has to be something that is continuous. The deliverers of that training is really, really critical. There is bad implicit bias training, and then there's excellent implicit bias training. The training that's excellent is the training that really provides us to go through an exercise with each other. It's not where the trainer is in front of you and rambling on about a whole bunch of this, that, and the other. But it's where we are forced to honestly deal with things that we probably never even thought to ask and question our own selves about. And that becomes the breaking of the bias, right? And then once we somewhat begin to break that bias thought we had that we didn't even know we had, we can then, work to reconstruct a new way of thinking and a new way of understanding someone else's position and where they come from, and understanding their story. I have to work on it all the time myself. I do have certain biases that I have to constantly work on. I can be very judgmental. I'm a very productive person. And so I can assume when someone's not moving at the pace that I'm moving at, that they're just not with it. They're lazy. They don't want to do anything. And that's a bias that I actually have, because I am a productive person and I have to work on that. And I've been working on that for 15 years, and I still have to work on that when I find myself having those thoughts, right? So that's a little bit about implicit bias. I hope I somewhat answered that question.
No, that was very helpful. Did it work? I mean, so you all had 4 hours of, was it group in-person training? I'm getting into the details because I think
yes. So we did. We had, and everyone had to go through it. It was mandated. You had the time off, even with the board members. We physically had, well, all of the board members in the state of California, we all live in different areas. I live in Los Angeles, so we all had to go to Sacramento. And we were probably, the board has over 200 board staff. So probably each time a session was about 25 people, and they could have a little bit smaller. And we were intentionally designed, like when we first came in, you know how everybody does, they sit with the person they know and like. They intentionally made us flip the seats. So you weren't sitting with someone that you comfortably knew, right? Intentionally sitting with someone you absolutely didn't know. And so that really worked, because then when we got into our smaller work groups, you know, I had a chance to be with somebody who was an investigator, and then somebody someone who took complaints, you know, someone who answered the phone at the medical board and took in complaints. And it was really good for me to actually understand the dynamics and the thought processes that each of these people had as they received the information at varying levels, right? So the complaint person was frontline. The investigators is when it gets a little deeper. And then me giving them context to what all of their information, how it all sums up and comes to me, and how important it is, because I'm the final arbiter, right, for every discipline that happens, meaning the board members. how important the factual data of that information is for us to make the right decision. And so we were all then bounded by each other in understanding our role from beginning to end.
That's very interesting. So I have kind of two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, you went through that incredible training. You also systematically took out what was thought to be information that would lead to perhaps judgment. Was that based on things that you came up in the implicit bias training, or is that just sort of kind of a consensus of what could possibly be leading to these biased decisions against Hispanic and Black physicians? So I'm going to ask that one first, and then I have another one.
Okay. So what we did really is we asked ourselves, where is bias? What is bias? And when we really started to dig into that, and we then looked at our cases, and we said, well, if I saw that somebody went to Stanford, I'm going to think differently about them, right? Than someone maybe who went to Howard University and got their degree. But I shouldn't be thinking differently about those. But our bias, because we think of Ivy League schools as being a certain way and other schools being being another way. And so as we started to think along this line of where do we all have innately our own biases, or biases that have been created by society? And we said, of course, the school, age discrimination. We used to have, and I can be honest and tell you guys this, we used to put people's ages on the documents. We used to put a ton of information on the document, like right at the very beginning. So before I even get into the details of the case, what were the actions that happened that caused the potential discipline, I had all this data about you. So before I even began to read anything, I had an assumption. You went to Ivy League, you didn't go to Ivy League. You were old, or you just came out of, you just started your practice. And all of those weighed on our decision making. If you were older, like 72, and you made a mistake, okay, you should just retire. Okay, I'm going to revoke your license. I'm not saying we did that, but that's a mindset I could have. So we removed things like that would make us start thinking before we actually got into the factual case to make a decision. And so we took all that out. And so we read now just simply, that you have a medical license, that you're board certified, and we do have the year that you have. So we do have an idea of how old you are. But that's probably it. That's the only thing, that we do potentially do have to make any decision really about you.
Carla, you're muted.
Yeah, no, no, thanks for that. That's, it's giving us a framework to sort of understand the work ahead. Anyone other questions? I know Sherry and I have our questions lined up, but if anyone else has questions.
Dr. Miller has her hand raised. I don't know how she did the little blue hand, but I see her there. So there you go.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation and advocating for physicians of color. We are happy to have someone on our side.
Of course.
I just want to say I've done work on cultural competency, and just to talk about the implicit bias that you're saying that over 15 years you've been working on your bias, and I think cultural competency goes along with this. And what I found here with interviewing some of the physicians here at Stanford, providers that had high and low scores on cultural competency, both were requesting more training. So people, I feel like providers really feel that they don't get enough training. And I think this is definitely, like what Dr. Pugh was saying too, is finding a way where it doesn't feel like you're checking off a box, but really having it institutionalized where people who feel like they have difficulties with certain cultural interactions with their patients, because that's also another side, can get the training that they need to navigate these situations. The other thing that I would like to say is I feel like as a minority physician, you do feel like you have to like carry yourself in a certain way that, you know, sometimes you just want to like relax and not be on all the time. And I think it's really hard. So I thank you for acknowledging that. And then I also want to say, maybe in terms of like evaluations and implicit bias, is it possible to find a way that we can check ourselves? Because sometimes like in certain processes, we evaluate people. And is there a way that like, okay, these we're having we do biannuals, right? Mm-hmm. And is there a way to say, okay, everyone that's on this committee, how about you review what your biases are as a way to like get into a mindset when you evaluate certain residents or faculty, that you're not really taking those biases with you in the evaluation process. I don't know if that's
you know, I don't know if we can say that we don't take our biases with us, right? I'm always going to be a productive person. I'm always going to be that way, right? But I now know how to pause on putting that off on someone else, putting that expectation off on someone else. And that's what we have to recognize, right? So recognizing how we're putting something off on someone else, right? And that's not necessarily a checkbox that you can do somewhere, but it is recognizing, did I already have a thought before the encounter with someone, right? So if a patient comes in and they look a certain way, did I already perceive them to be something? If I see someone who's overweight, did I already perceive you to not have control of your health, to not understand how to eat, to overeat, before I even evaluate you and find out maybe you have a thyroid problem? And that is the reason why you have more retention of weight. Did I do that? Those are the things we have to self-correct. Those are the things we have to recognize within ourselves. And to allow that person come to us as they are and discover who they are and not make assumptions about who they are. And that kind of is what has happened in our society, right? That really poor care. And we have to recognize that there is poor care in COVID-19. And that poor care continues to happen today. I mean, it's staggering, even with us having the knowledge that people of color are impacted the most, they're still not getting tested appropriately. They're still being rejected from care when they go to the hospital. And this is still happening, and we know that, and we know this because this is still the mindset of the areas that they're going to. They're not just recognizing it. There's also this sort of false belief that African Americans have a high pain threshold, and so they're not given appropriate medicine sometimes for the pain that they're experiencing. And that is, again, another implicit thinking that, yes, Black people have endured, they have endured a lot, and they have the capacity to endure a lot. But that doesn't mean that they should be treated any different when it comes to the healthcare, because we do know that about them.
I guess my question is, how do we fix this? Like, how do we get people to acknowledge this? And I think in my thing, I think I just don't think we have enough training um, instituted for us to like really recognize that we're doing these biases. And I don't know if there's a way, like how you evaluated with certain physicians being rated more heavily or targeted, if there's a way we can find a way to evaluate this to see how like our biases towards patients, and then also train them. And so I think that I just want to, I think we need,
I think there's, I have to find out. I think there might be sort of a general test that everyone can take, and it's not about, it's not physician related, but it's just a broad test that helps to determine where you may have some biases. Some biases can just simply be what part of town you live on, right? We just have a sense, a lot of times when you meet people, especially in LA, LA is so massive, you always ask like, oh, so where do you live? If you say, oh, I live in Huntington Beach or Newport Beach, everybody's like, oh, okay. If you say you live in South Central, it's like, oh, okay, right? So that's just one. And there are great people that live in both areas, right? Thriving, doing well, healthy, contributing to society, and yet we have those thoughts. And that's a really simple, but it still is a bias. I just believe that, in terms of an organization, you have to be committed to improving the culture. And you have to decide what kind of culture you want to have. Understanding what culture is, and then deciding what kind of culture do you want to have, and then what do we need to do to have that kind of culture? What kind of training? What kind of beliefs do we need to have? How does that unfold in everything that we do, right? Even do our charts look right? Are the kinds of questions we asking our patients, are they consistent? Am I asking these patients these questions when they come in? I'm asking these patients these questions. Are we consistent? Do we have consistency in our practice? That's how you actually get to more health equity, is consistency in the practice.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. This is really helpful. Mary, you had a question?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry.
I can't hear Mary.
My Wi-Fi. I'm going to leave my video take up too much bandwidth. But first, I want to Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about all that technology. So I want to thank you for being with us. Thank you for using your leadership position really to advance our understanding of how our biases can really have major impacts on individuals, on their health, and on their careers, most importantly, in your role. And so kind of getting to Mikkel's question is, people can understand that they have a bias, but how do they understand that they're ready to change that? And how do you hold each other accountable at the board when you see things happening? Because I think this is where we're on our journey right now, is trying to really understand some of the structure that is contributing, helped us form our biases, but change is hard work. So how did you accomplish that beyond training?
People don't want to change. They think they're fine just as they are. I mean, when I was in the first session, there were, people, I don't want to be here. Why do I have to be here? I don't need this. I'm just trying to do my job. This is stopping me from I could be doing X, Y, Z right now. Nobody wants to do it, right? Nobody wants to do it, but it is the betterment for everyone when you do it. And it was so interesting that one woman who just was bantering on that way, as we got further into the hours of what we were doing, she suddenly had like this aha moment and recognized that she had a case in which she realized that there was bias happening, and she talked about it, and decided that she was going to change her approach. I mean, this was a woman who was absolutely resistant right in the meeting, talking loud, you know, and I was thinking like, lady, I'm the president of the medical board. Are you actually talking like this? But I thought, no, I'm going to be okay and let everyone express themselves, because people don't want to change. People don't feel like they know what their job is. I'm smart. Why do I have to do this? I know how to do what I'm supposed to do. And of course, we had doctors in there. But no, we all could learn. And if you enter, just be open to seeing, you know, what is it that I can at least learn, and be open to. You might see something that you didn't see before, right? It may not even be you so much. It could be a colleague that you might decide you're going to have a conversation with. It could be a nurse that you have observed, and now you have more context to what it is you can say to her, because now you've been inside this session, and you now have a better way to talk to her about how she's engaging with patients. It could be an administrator, and how they are having conversations with doctors differently. So the training is not something anyone is want to do. I mean, definitely your doctors are going to say, I don't have time for this. You know, I already do CME. That's enough of my training that I need to do. But it really is going to be helpful to everyone. And then it's just really looking at, you know, how do you change what you have done? And there might be some cost parameters. And that's the reason why, you know, I said earlier how we had to go to legislators, because we may have needed to ask for some additional money once we found out what the recommendations were going to be, right? So change also has cost to it. Training is going to be costly. It's going to be the cost of the time that everybody from top to bottom has to take out whatever amount of hours you allow for this to happen. And I really believe that it needs to be personal. I don't believe that it's an online training. I don't think that that's not successful.
Pat, you have a question?
Yes.
You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes. Uh-huh.
I want to ask a question on the opposite side as a patient to a physician. How do you, as a person, get your physician to listen to a concern that you have about your health? Like, for example, your doctor puts you on a certain medication, and you come back, and I work with a lot of great doctors, and I ask questions, and you know, they answer my questions, and I research online. And I come back to this doctor and I say, well, hey, you know, this medication is known to cause, you know, adverse reaction in African Americans. You know, I don't want to keep taking this. Can you prescribe something else? Oh, no. You're okay. That's fine. That's fine. Only to later have a severe reaction and then have to go to the ER and have the doctors and the medical staff in the ER say, yes, you know, we've seen a lot of patients of color have adverse reactions to this medication, so you should definitely not take this. So I guess, you know, how do I get a physician to listen to what I'm saying? Because I think that's part of the reason why so many African Americans don't trust their physicians, because they feel like they're not being heard.
Yes, and I think that's a challenge for all the doctors who are on the Zoom call, is that we have to listen. You're partners in the care, right? The patient is a partner. You're their partner in their health care. And yes, you're the doctor, but you're not in their body. You have to listen to what the patients are saying to you. Even when you know better, or you have more knowledge. And I know I hear a lot of this from my doctor friends, where oh my God, I have these patients, they come in going to WebMD with pages of stuff that they've read. And I always say, I said, isn't that exciting that they're trying to be participatory in their healthcare? And a lot of them will stop and go, I never really looked at it like that. I just looked at it like they're trying to tell me what to do, or they're trying to, bring, information that tends to be false or whatever. And I said, no, I mean, look at it that they're trying to be proactive. We have more people trying to be proactive with their care, we would actually see, better results. So I think that, sometimes you might have to go to a different doctor, honestly. You can't make a doctor not listen to you if he's not listening to you. And if you have presented examples of, in your case, if you've presented examples of how something has been adverse to a particular group, and the doctor doesn't say, hey, let me, I don't have time to review this at the moment, I do want to study this more, let me take this information and let me get back to you. May even say, in the meantime, I want you to continue on this protocol. At least do that. If they're not willing to do that, I think you have to go to another doctor.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Pat. Sherry, you have a question?
Yeah, Denise, so when you look at the Medical Board of California, I would say it as an entity has tried, and I'm going to use the word generously, tried to affect policy, such as when they did the mandatory CME on pain, through the publications, vaccines, the opioid crisis, et cetera. How could the medical board more successfully kind of help in this education process about really what we're talking about is equity in treatment of patients across California in all communities? And could you tell us sort of maybe a vision that you're starting to think about for that, of really harnessing the board, which does communicate with all licensed practitioners, because we also have our nurse practitioners, our physician's assistants, the nursing. I mean, the board has an incredible power to try to change this. So how do you see harnessing that power effectively to really lead what you're talking about forward into 2021 to 2022?
That's a great question. I think it's, when I came on board, I helped the board to get a vision. It actually didn't have a vision statement, right? And how did we see ourselves as improving the health of Californians? And because when we see ourselves like being, part of health equity and part of improving health lives, it helps to open our minds to what could be possible and let us think beyond a regulatory force. So we do have an education committee. We have not met in a little while. I'm on that committee. And I think what I like to do is actually bring this challenge that you're posing to me to that committee, and to have us actually look at what we can do, because we do have resources through that committee to do exactly what you have sort of asked me the question and charged us to do. So I'm going to take that back to our board.
That would be great. Just don't make it a 10-hour CME. I think, as you said, that's the regulatory punitive.
That's the regulatory cure, right? Yeah. That's the regulatory cure.
I always sort of think about this as, the state of California for all supervisors has the mandatory 2-hour, not 1 second, shorter than sexual harassment training. And we can see how effective that's been over the years.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah. And I think someone has a bill recommending CME, implicit bias training.
But as you said, the devil's always in the details on this one.
Yes, yeah. It is. Yeah. And, again, doctors are resistant to, they feel their time, and I totally understand this. Doctors we all have the same 24 hours in the day. And each time we require a new CME or, any additional process, even cures. Everybody was fighting cures when we made that mandatory. Anything that, takes more time is frustrating for the doctor and becomes, they become more and more resistant. So even doing cultural competency, doing implicit bias training is not going to be, embraced. It's just not, because of their time. They want to do what doctors do. But if doctors are not performing effectively, whether they think they are or not, if they're not performing effectively, to Patricia's question of asking me that, a patient is saying I'm having adverse reactions, then they have to go through some kind of, reprogramming in some way.
Thanks so much. Really, this is helpful.